In September of 1710, Mrs. Ann Hattridge, widow of the late Reverend John Hattridge, a Scottish-born Presbyterian minister in Islandmagee, County Antrim, who had died 13 years earlier, quietly began to experience unexplained annoyances at her son James Hattridge's home in Knowhead House in Kilcun, Islandmagee, where she lived. While seated by the kitchen fire, she felt small pebbles striking her back and shoulders, seemingly emanating from out of thin air. Though unharmed, the widow looked around, and seeing nothing to explain the unsettling events, became deeply unnerved. Soon after, Anne's bedroom became the focal point of pure chaos. Invisible forces hurled stones and peat at her bed, while the curtains around her four-poster were violently torn back and forth. Her bed covers were yanked away from where she slept, and her pillows aggressively pulled from under her head by unseen hands. Yet, a frantic search of her room revealed no plausible explanation, no culprit. Welcome to Part 2 of Storyteller's Hearthfireside Tales 4-part series on the Islandmagee Witch Trials of 1711. In Part 2, The Supernatural Events, we witness how a local, highly respected professional family endured sustained psychological trauma by ethereal forces that left their family grieving, while experiencing intense public scrutiny, social stigma that risked their reputations and financial ruin. If you enjoy these subjects the way we do and how we present them, please like and subscribe to encourage us to make more. If you have not yet seen Part 1, in which we review the cultural, religious and legal backdrop of Ulster at the time of these hauntings, you may do so by going to the link in the description of this video. While this episode can act as a standalone, Part 1 will give you much more insight into the thought processes and worldviews of the people involved. This episode draws in a large part from both St. John D. Seymour's Irish Witchcraft and Demonology, published in 1913, and a collection of documents from the trial of the Islandmagee witches at Carrickfergus Assizes in 1711, that were edited by Andrew Snedden and Shannon Devlin and other sources. Nestled along County Antrim's rugged southeastern coast, this slender peninsula of Islandmagee stretches like a windswept ribbon between the towns of Whitehead and Larne. About 8 miles long and less than 3 miles wide, its lengthy cliff-edged coastline, interrupted here and there by sheltered sandy coves, have long tied its people to the sea. Attracted by its reputation for healthful air, fertile soils, and bountiful seas, the peninsula began to be settled mainly by lowland Scottish immigrants during the 17th century under King James I's 1610 Plantation of Ulster plan. This plan was so successful that by 1622, the Scots made up some 60% of the population of Islandmagee, which allowed them to begin to dominate the region's socio-political fabric. By then, the native Irish survived as an underclass. Their traditions, such as cunning folk, keening, and fairy doctors, were stigmatized as superstition, while the Irish language, Brehon law, and Catholic religious practices continued to be suppressed. Over the subsequent centuries, the peninsula's emerald fields and dramatic puffin-dotted cliffs have shaped a quiet, resilient community rooted in farming, fishing, and seafaring. It is a place where the cry of gulls mingles with the creak of fishing boats, and the rhythms of the land echo the pulse of the tides. Though relatively sparsely populated, Islandmagee, legacy as a haven for agriculture and maritime traditions, endure as much as its postcard beauty does today. As part of a general unrest across Ireland, a rebellion broke out in Islandmagee in November of 1641, as local Catholics rose up against the English and Scottish Protestant settler interlopers, which quickly spiraled into sectarian violence. In a broader pattern of retaliatory aggression against perceived rebel sympathizers, government troops stationed at Carrickfergus attacked the Catholic civilians living in Islandmagee in what became infamously known as the Islandmagee Massacre. Although competing reports varied widely depending upon the agenda of who wrote them, modern estimates based on population and other analyses are that around 24 Catholics in Islandmagee were killed, and probably many more purged from the area, so that by 1710 the peninsula was overwhelmingly Presbyterian, with a significant Church of Ireland minority and only a smattering of Catholics. By the winter of 1710, the terror in No Head House had intensified. Bedclothes were being ripped away nightly, forcing the widow, Ann Hattridge, who had become greatly upset by her phantom harassers, into sharing her room with a servant girl. The attacks paused only when a candle was burning in the bedroom, but resumed immediately the flame died out. One night, Anne awoke in terror when she felt an animal, she believed to be the size of a rat, crawling up her body. Convinced the family cat was to blame, she ordered a search for the feline, but it was nowhere in the house. Unable to endure any more of this mental anguish, Mrs. Hattridge moved her bed to sleep with her son and daughter-in-law. Days later, when the wretched cat appeared in the house, the family swiftly dispatched the unfortunate animal, hoping to end their torments. But when they tossed its body outside, it vanished without a trace. After killing the cat familiar, the household enjoyed a brief respite until a few days later, Anne's walking cane disappeared from the hall stand, only to reappear as mysteriously as it had vanished a few days earlier. On the evening of the 11th of December, 1710, as Mrs. Hattridge was seated with her servants warming by the kitchen hearth, a ghostly, wildering figure materialized at her back door. It resembled a young boy who looked to be no older than 10 or 12. Mrs. Hattridge initially took him to be a beggar boy, who, without a word, came in and sat down beside her, as if to warm himself. Since he seemed to be deliberately masking his face behind his tattered black blanket, Anne was unable to make out his facial features, except for his short dark hair. He was dressed in a threadbare black vest, and his malnourished frame was wrapped in his frayed blanket, which drug on the floor behind him as he moved. Mrs. Hattridge, who sat unsettled but composed, urged the boy, she supposed was from one of the many beggar families roaming the countryside, after they had been displaced by the countless upheavals over the past 100 years, to reveal his face. When he sat completely ignoring her, she pressed him a little harder, inquiring who he was and if he was hungry or lost. But the child remained silent, his hollow gaze fixed straight ahead towards the flames in the fireplace. Suddenly, and without any warning, he sprang up and began an eerie, jerking dance around the room before darting outside. The servants followed in trail as he ran through the garden and into the cow byre, where they lost sight of him in the dark. Over the next few hours, he reappeared a dozen more times, repeating his bizarre performances. Some witness accounts say Mrs. Hattridge, becoming increasingly annoyed at the boy's rude behavior, warned him if he persisted in his disruptive conduct, her son James would enforce severe repercussions on him when he came home. Not long after, the phantom boy's haunting paused when the family dog began to bark, alerting everyone Mr. Hattridge had arrived home, causing the spectral boy to flee and not be seen again for a few months. However, during this lull from the boy's mischievous pranks, the usual strange occurrences in the bedroom persisted as before. Then in February, as she was reading alone in the parlour, Mrs. Hattridge's cherished copy of Wedderburn's sermons disappeared, vanishing the moment she set the prized volume down. Authored in 1567 by Robert Wedderburn, a prominent priest from Dundee who broke from the Catholic faith and became an early Scottish Protestant reformer, wrote his seminal work, David's Testament, a collection of metrical psalms and devotional poetry, many translated from German, that are influenced by Calvinist reformist doctrine. His earlier work, published in 1548, The Complaint of Scotland, preached against the iniquities brought on by the nobility and corrupt clergy. Embracing Wedderburn's reformist theology would have reinforced the Hattridges' belief that witchcraft was a literal manifestation of Satan's war against God's elect. Their actions during their tribulations of combining piety, legal rigor, and communal vigilance reflected this theology that saw witchcraft as both a spiritual and civic threat. The next day, the boy in black reappeared outside the house. With a violent crack, he shattered a kitchen window pane, thrusting his arm through the broken glass to wave the missing book. He then engaged the scullery maid, Margaret Spear, who was nearby in a chilling one-sided exchange, his voice unheard by everyone else in the room, except Mrs. Hattridge, who, though unable to see him, caught every word the phantom spoke. "Do you want a book?" the apparition asked. "No," replied Margaret Spear. "How came you to lie?" the apparition defiantly inquired, "for this is the book which the old gentlewoman wanted yesterday." "How came you by it?" inquired Margaret. "I went down quietly to the parlour when you were all in the kitchen, and found it lying upon a shelf with a Bible and pair of spectacles," he replied. Margaret Spear asked, "How came it that you did not take the Bible too?" possibly wondering whether the devilish apparition would have been able to touch a Bible. "It was too heavy to carry," was his excuse. "Will you give it back?" asked Margaret, "for my mistress can't want it any longer." "No, she shall never get it again," the apparition taunted. Margaret asked, "Can you read it?" "Yes," the apparition maintained. Showing surprise, Margaret asked, "Who taught you?" Her curiosity piqued because free schooling for the working classes was not yet available in Ireland, and she herself would have been unlikely to have been literate. The imp's answer would have immediately given him a psychological advantage over the distraught girl. The apparition menacingly replied that it had been the devil who taught him, implying serving his master has certain advantages denied to the servant girl. Unnerved at this, Margaret Spear spurted out, "The Lord bless me from thee, thou hast got ill lear." Lear is a late Middle English word that was common in Scotland and northern England, meaning learning, being from the verb lere, meaning to teach. Margaret was clearly saying, despite his being literate, she believed his education was defective. Still taunting the girl, the apparition warned, "Aye, bless yourself 20 times, but that shall not save you." Terrified, Margaret Spear began to inquire, "What will you do to us?" At this point, James Hattridge's 8-year-old son went over and stood beside Margaret. With a swoosh, the apparition suddenly drew a sword and thrust it through the broken window, snarling a frightening threat. "I will kill everyone in the house with my sword." Upon hearing Margaret's terrifying account of the conversation, the panicked young boy cried out, "Meg! Let us go into the room and bar the door, for fear it should kill us." Once they had barricaded themselves inside an adjacent room, the spectre immediately appeared outside a window of the locked room, where, as he stared in, he continued his menacing taunts. "Now you think you're safe enough, but I'll get in yet." Feeling a little more secure, Margaret asked the spectre, "What way? For we have the street door shut." But undeterred, the apparition insisted, "I can come in by the least hole in the house, like a cat or a mouse, for the devil can make me anything I please," signalling he had a familiar's power of shape-shifting. Horrified at learning of his ungodly supernatural powers of the Pooka from the other world, Margaret replied, "God bless me from thee, for thou art no earthly creature if you can do that." To demonstrate its superpower as a warning for things to come, the trickster then grabbed a large stone and hurled it into the parlour through a glass window, leaving a hole in the pane smaller than the size of the rock he had thrown before, briefly vanishing. Soon after, the children in the house, who by now sat constant vigil at the windows, witnessed the boy and black apparition return and, seizing a turkey cock, a guinea fowl, so named because in the 18th century, Turkey was the main supplier of these birds from sub-Saharan Africa, and leap with it over the garden wall. It later returned, still clutching the bird and brandishing a sword as if to slaughter it. But the fowl was able to escape when the untamed force readjusted its grip to enact the coup de grace. Enraged, the spectre then smashed 2 more window panes with a club. Peering out a broken window, one of the children saw the apparition digging a hole beside the house. When she asked what it was doing, it answered by saying it was digging a grave. "For whom?" asked the young girl in a state of alarm. "For a corpse which will come out of this house very soon," was the cruel foreshadowing response. The girl, visibly shaken, then inquired, "Who will it be?" "I won't tell you that yet. Is your master at home?" "Yes," replied the girl. "How can you lie? He is abroad and is dead 14 days ago," the boy taunted. While it was true Mr. Hattridge was abroad on business at that time, the apparition revealed he too was a liar by falsely declaring Hattridge's death. Now completely unnerved, the girl asked, "Of what sickness did he die?" "I won't tell you that." And with a scoff, the presence soared like a bird over the hedge and vanished. After word got around of all the turmoil in No Head House, neighbours began to arrive in droves to investigate the goings-on for themselves, some out of curiosity, some to point sanctimonious fingers, and others out of genuine concern. But no one could find anything out of the ordinary that would explain the multiple unusual eyewitness accounts. Then, at 8 in the morning, turf and debris began to fly again. Detritus was hurled through the windows without interruption until 3 in the afternoon, terrifying everyone inside. Mrs. Hattridge and the rest of the huddled household were so frightened, no one was willing to venture out to alert the others in the neighborhood. The following Tuesday and Wednesday passed quietly, but by Thursday morning, the bedclothes in Mrs. Hattridge's room were again mysteriously piled up on the floor at the foot of her bed. Each time servants remade the bed, the sheets and bolster were torn off and folded into the shape of a corpse and tucked under a large table. This grim ritual, seen by everyone as an omen of Anne's impending death, continued for the next 8 days. When asked why she persisted in staying in that haunted room, Mrs. Hattridge replied, "It's not good to give place to the devil," and expressed relief that at least the devils had no power over her grandchildren. Prominent neighbours and church leaders, including the Presbyterian minister, the Reverend Robert Sinclair, along with 2 of his church elders, John Main and Reynold Leiths, decided to investigate the mayhem for themselves. Having been convinced no trickery was involved, they initially attributed the Pooka-like activity to an unknown invisible force, and joined with other devout Christians in nightly prayer vigils at No Head House, while the disturbances raged on. A Pooka was a type of mischievous Ishi, or fairy related to Shakespeare's Puck, who were known for their pranks, which were sometimes quite malevolent and designed to test the limits of one's endurance. The Pooka, who lived for chaos, were best known for their shape-shifting abilities and often appeared in the guises of many animals, such as dark, sleek horses with glowing yellow eyes, or mysterious strangers who engaged their quarry in tricks, riddles, debates, and games of wit, all designed to spread confusion. Often, a Pooka's malice was directed towards those who disrespected the land or violated its traditions. One night, as Ann Hattridge slept, she woke the household with a blood-curdling cry of agony, claiming it felt as if someone had stabbed her in her back with something akin to a knife. This excruciating pain persisted, without a break from then on, until the poor soul finally succumbed a week later. In her final agonizing days, her bedclothes continued to be fashioned daily into a corpse-like shape, despite the family weighing them down with heavy furniture. Remarkably, the phenomena invariably ceased the moment someone entered the room, preventing anyone from directly observing the incidents as they happened. The night before her death saw a worrying change in this routine. Instead of being formed into the shape of a corpse, this last time Anne's blankets and sheets were meticulously folded and stored away in an upstairs blanket chest. The whereabouts of the bedding was only discovered after an extensive search of the house by the servants. Shortly after finding them, Mrs. Ann Hattridge died peacefully in a final reprieve from her painful torments, reportedly in a state of spiritual calm on the 22nd of February 1711. After her burial, the household experienced a brief respite until the 27th of February, when James Hattridge's sister and her daughter, 18-year-old Mary Dunbar, arrived at Knowhead House from Castlereagh in County Down to mourn. By all contemporary accounts, Mary, who was Mr. James Hattridge's first cousin, impressed their neighbours as a sensible, well-educated young girl of good character. On the first night of their arrival, her newly tailored Scottish-style mantua dress, headscarves, and other bits of female clothing were mysteriously pulled from the visitor's travelling trunk and scattered all over the house, with Mary's treasured dress lying outside and smeared with mud. Mixed in with the scattered clothing, they found an apron belonging to the Hattridges, which had been packed away for 2 days, now rolled up and tied with 5 peculiar knots. Everyone was aware in folk magic traditions these types of cryptic knots held a symbolic power in binding spells intended to influence another person's will or fate. Practitioners of the occult arts often tied these knots while focusing on a specific intended outcome, using materials like thread, ribbon, reeds, or hair. This act was seen as sealing the spell, akin to how a wedding ring symbolizes the binding of marital vows, with both rituals relying on physical objects to manifest abstract commitments. The use of personal belongings such as clothing or hair in such spells stemmed from the belief that these items retained a connection to or some remaining essence of their owner, allowing the practitioner to channel binding energy through them. It is interesting to note that modern-day scientists can use a personal object to collect DNA from its long-dead owner. Despite the household seemingly understanding the otherworldly significance of these knots, young Mary Dunbar bravely, or maybe foolhardily, volunteered to untie them, revealing a flannel cap inside that had belonged to the late Mrs. Hattridge. Since the cap had vanished just after her death, it sparked fears among those present that someone using a malicious charm had targeted their family member. For many of the people in attendance, this would have been confirmation enough that the late Mrs. Hattridge had been the victim of a horrendous, deadly bewitchment. and in untying these unusual knots, Mary was at risk of unleashing the hex upon herself. By the 28th of February, the mayhem resumed. Bedclothes were tossed about, and Mary, while climbing the stairs, collapsed, crying out in agony from a severe stabbing pain in her thigh, just like the one that had killed her grandmother barely a week earlier. After briefly recovering from her agonizing phantom knife attack, they regularly repeated in spasms every 8 minutes, sometimes in her back, and at other times in her head or breasts. By 3 a.m, she fell into an episode of violent thrashing and shouting, alarming the household. Upon recovering, Mary described being visited by a vision of a disheveled woman wearing a soiled biggie, a Scottish farmwife's headscarf, who threatened to kill her. During this trance-like attack, the people present overheard Mary pleading with God for protection, shouting, "Fie! Fie! On you, wicked woman!" which was a common Ulster Scots way of exclaiming shame. Shame on you. Taking comfort in God saving his people during biblical times, Mary continued her monologue. God preserved Job and the Israelites, and he'll protect me too. Upon pulling through, Mary told the people around her how she had been tortured by 2 spectres, who, while talking amongst themselves, had inadvertently identified themselves as Janet Mean and Janet Carson. Unknown to Mary, these were the names of 2 well-known local females. Mary had now named names of real living people, despite insisting she had neither met nor heard of either of them before. After identifying her assailants, Mary's turns intensified when her invisible visitors allegedly became more determined to silence her by threatening to murder her if she continued to identify them. Again, witnesses heard her one-sided arguments with these unseen demons, as she alternated between desperate pleading prayers to God and defiant maledictions against the apparitions. On the 1st of March, 1711, at around 4 a.m, Mary recovered from having 3 violent episodes in a row, and again, despite the dire threats, explicitly named Janet Carson as one of her diabolical persecutors. Carson's daughter, who had now entered the house, grew distraught at hearing her mother's name being identified with these Mephistophelian monsters, and sought guidance from the Reverend Robert Sinclair, the local Presbyterian minister. Sinclair urged her to quietly inform her mother, and suggested she ask Janet to visit Mary to test whether she would be able to identify her in person. By demonstrating Mary's inability to recognize the real Janet, they would demonstrate to the anxious community that she was innocent, which would clear her now sullied name. Janet Carson reluctantly agreed to the experiment after an initial hesitation. When the Reverend Sinclair secretly arrived with Janet at the house, Mary, who was unaware of the experiment and didn't know Janet Carson would be coming, suddenly cried out, "There's Janet Carson!" as she fell into a violent frenzy. This time it required 3 men to restrain her small feminine frame as she thrashed wildly in her bed. According to some accounts, Mary herself issued threats, curses, and blasphemed while flinging Bibles around the room during these episodes. But this is more likely to have been an added enhancement during the generations of retellings of a story meant to fit a theory among some ultra-Orthodox Christians that she was demon-possessed. However, if this were true, it would have been doubtful whether Mary would have retained her reputation for being virtuous with so many people, including numerous clergy. In addition, one vicar who attended the proceedings likened Mary's torments to the trials of Job. Since the main lesson from Job is that, despite his trials, he refused to blaspheme God, It would have been unlikely the good Reverend Doctor would have made this comparison with Mary if she had been engaged in blaspheming, throwing Bibles, spitting on the cross, or some such diabolical act. When asked, Carson initially resisted praying for Mary, insisting, "I've done her no wrong," but eventually relented after much persuasion. Her initial resistance to pray for Mary, and her somehow linking it to a sign of her culpability, was not lost on the people present. They wondered how Mary, a stranger to Islandmagee, and presumably had never met Carson, was able to so accurately describe this, a low-set, well-favoured woman. Everybody agreed Mary's detailed description perfectly matched Carson's appearance, which gave credulity to her amazing story in their minds. In an era when ugliness or deformities were thought to be physical signs of moral corruption, Carson's fine-looking features defied the witch stereotype, yet Mary, after seeing her in person, remained adamant Janet Carson was one of them. Carson's attractive appearance contrasted starkly with Mary's portrayal of another of her oppressors when she described this second woman as wearing a dirty biggie upon her head and having a swarthy face, large rolling eyes, very thick lips, a lame foot, and low stature. At a time when working-class rural women spent much of their waking hours outdoors, a swarthy wind and sunburned face and dirt-stained hands were side effects of this lifestyle. Mary, on the other hand, would have grown up in relative refinement in a family that placed emphasis on schooling that aimed at cultivating a virtuous Presbyterian woman, proficient in the 3 R's: needlework, art, music, and psalm singing, household management, and other indoor activities that were in alignment with the Kirk's emphasis on communal literacy. Someone with a swarthy countenance would have been, outside casual encounters at church, excluded from her social setting. They would have been seen but rarely engaged. Mary also depicted a third younger, prettier female spectre, who similarly was affected with a lame leg. This younger girl was the one who had jeered and mocked Mary from her bedside whenever she was in the throes of the most intense, violent phantom stabbing pains. Later that night, while the kitchen fire burned unattended, bedclothes mysteriously found their way into the flames and partly burned. But things took a more dangerous new turn when a servant upstairs was injured by a 1.5-pound boulder hurled at her by an unseen entity in the corner of the room, its loud crashing sound startling everyone in the house. Meanwhile, the usual turf and stones continued to rain into the kitchen as the anarchy remained constant without abatement, even as a minister fervently prayed inside. That evening concerned neighbours summoned Janet Liston and her daughter Elizabeth Seller, whom many had long believed to be witches and perfectly match Mary's physical descriptions. When approached, Janet Liston refused outright to visit Mary, declaring, "If the devil took that girl's health, let the devil restore it." "Devil take you all!" Janet continued defiantly. "I will not go for all Islandmagee unless Mr. Sinclair comes for me." Determined to reinforce her resolve, Janet expounded with a prayer. "If the plague of God was on Mary Dunbar, ye plague of God be on them altogether. The devil be with them, if he was among them. If God hath taken her health from her, God give her health. If the devil hath taken it from her, the devil give her it." Concluding her diatribe with a damning rebuke, Janet warned, "O misbelieving ones, eating and drinking damnation to themselves, crucifying Christ afresh, and taking all out of the hands of the devil." This final statement was a theological indictment blending scriptural authority, sacramental theology, and demonology. Seen in the context of post-1641 rebellion Ulster, Such accusations of heresy or disloyalty were often conflated with religious or ethnic identities. The next morning being March the 2nd, their landlord, William Fenton, who was also a governing Presbyterian elder, threatened Janet and Elizabeth into visiting Mary. As they arrived, a large crowd gathered outside the Hattridge home, including the Reverend David Robb, a Church of Ireland curate, and the Reverend Robert Sinclair. These ministers organized a lineup of women to enter Mary's room one by one. Over 30 random women filed individually into the room for examination by Mary, but each time she didn't recognize the individual and remained calm until Janet Liston came. Upon seeing her, Mary immediately let out a scream and shrieked, "That's her!" and started thrashing so violently it required 3 men to restrain her trim teenage body. Witnesses trembled at the spectacle of Janet Liston coldly mumbling, "God grant her health," as she disdainfully looked at Mary's flailing spasms without showing any apparent empathy. Afterwards, the clergy privately interrogated both Janet and her daughter, Elizabeth, testing their grasp of prayers and church teachings. Both struggled, only being able to recite the Lord's Prayer and Apostles' Creed in fragmented, disjointed phrases. Neither were they able to answer basic doctrinal questions to the clergy's satisfaction. Unconvinced of Elizabeth's innocence, the ministers decided to press Janet's daughter to re-enter Mary's room for a second time, but on this occasion Mary accused her as well, collapsing into violent fits that subsided only when Elizabeth left. When asked why they thought they had both affected Mary so severely, Elizabeth Seller deflected by saying that maybe God punishes her more harshly for her sins now, to which Janet readily agreed. By attributing Mary Dunbar's suffering to divine punishment for her own sins, Elizabeth redirected attention away from herself and onto the afflicted. She deliberately invoked the Reformed doctrines of divine providence and predestination, which includes the idea of God actively governing all events, including divine retribution. She reframed Mary Dunbar's suffering as a moral lesson rather than evidence of witchcraft. At this point, the Reverend Robert Sinclair had heard enough from these women and determined Mary was probably being tormented by witches' familiars, who were taking on the form of spectres. On the 3rd of March 1711, to minimize her daily disruptions, Mary was moved upstairs. As she reached the top step where her ordeal had first begun, she collapsed and became limp, as if dead, with 3 strong men struggling to carry her drooping, inexplicably heavy body to her bedroom. Though physically slender, everyone marveled how Mary had become so heavy and almost immovable during these episodes. After returning downstairs, she drank beer, her first sustenance, other than water, for over 3 days, and slept for a solid 4 hours. On Sunday, the 4th of March, Mary accused another person she named Catherine, describing her as a large, dark-coloured woman. Soon, several local women named Catherine were rounded up and brought before Mary, but only Catherine McAlmond, a disagreeable figure with a bad reputation, provoked a violent fit. Witnesses James Blythe, James McAlexander, Mrs. Wilson, and Janet Martin watched as Mary lunged at McAlmond, but was prevented from touching her by some unseen force. Mary cried out, "Put the wicked woman away!" But McAlmond refused to leave unless everyone else in the room would go at the same time, presumably because she knew the seizures would stop as soon as she left. Something she knew would be seen as evidence and held against her in a court of law. The Reverend Robert Sinclair and William Brown both reported hearing an eerie, horse-like sound in the air whenever Catherine McAlmond neared the house. a sound Mary also connected to Catherine. William Brown, a ruling elder at Islandmagee Presbyterian Church, described hearing the same phantom hoofbeats when he was at No Head House. Throughout the day, Mary alternated between sudden fainting spells and desperate cries for help. "Leave me alone! God, deliver me from them!" She described being pricked with pins and pleaded with her invisible attackers for mercy, proclaiming her faith was unshakable despite their threats to kill her as they had done her grandmother. While the Reverend Sinclair prayed that morning, Janet McAlexander witnessed a bizarre sight. The minister's prayers appeared to provoke a cloth resembling the hem of a petticoat to spin in mid-air as if in a whirlwind, hovering a foot above the floor. The woman, finding no earthly explanation for what she had seen, became terrified. Several other witnesses over the course of the hauntings noticed increased paranormal activity with the presence of clergy, and whenever they recited prayers, read the Bible, or sung psalms. Later in the afternoon, William Fenton, Mr. Hatley, Robert Holmes, and James Blythe searched for charms or other occultic objects in Catherine McCalman's home. Two of the men also searched a nearby abandoned house. From his home a short distance away, Reverend Sinclair, peering through a spyglass, was able to watch the outside of Catherine's cottage, and swore he had seen a woman walking backward into the McCalmond house, though the search party found no one inside. Walking backwards and wearing clothes on backwards was sometimes done in an attempt to confuse the fairies or break a fairy charm. During their evening prayer vigil at the Hattridge home, Sinclair led the group in singing Psalm 142, and Mary immediately collapsed into a seizure. Her jaws clenched so tightly shut they had to place a wedge between her teeth to pry her mouth open to find her tongue doubled in her throat and thrust down her windpipe. After the psalm, Sinclair asked Mary what she had seen. As if out of breath, she gasped in reply that it was Kitty, a name she had given to Catherine McCalmond, with that lame woman, Janet Liston, Janet Main, the wife of Andrew Ferguson of Ballycarry, and Latimer, who had crawled into bed to torment her. A witness noticed Mary's episodes became more intensive whenever the Reverend Sinclair was praying, at the same time Latimer and Janet Main were in the house. Even Latimer's presence in the near vicinity provoked young Mary to be filled with a sense of unease and a faintish feeling. After the investigation, Janet Main's husband, Andrew Ferguson, remained unconvinced the girl he called the sick person was genuinely afflicted by witchcraft. To test Mary's claims, he agreed to let his wife covertly reappear before Mary. But as soon as Janet began to enter Mary's room, Mary erupted into a fit, despite Janet remaining cool, calm, and collected. Mary's tongue-tied fits returned relentlessly. Each time after her tongue was freed, she'd jolt awake and claim she had felt a pinprick-like pains. By midnight, her seizures subsided, and finally was able to sleep peacefully until dawn, waking to ask for a beer, her first sustenance in over a day. The spectral figures mocking Mary sneeringly remarked to each other, "They're making a fuss over her now, but soon those tending her will suffer just as she does." They repeatedly urged her to abandon her religious practices, such as prayer and psalm singing, claiming, "We serve a better master. Do as we say, and you'll be healed." In one chilling exchange, the spectral figures boasted of pranks they had pulled on the husbands of some of the women present. "I left a besom, which is a broom with obvious witch associations, in his bed. one of the figures taunted, while another phantom sneered, "I left a twist of straw I crafted myself," referring to a fairy charm intended to cause harm, nightmares, and bad luck. Janet Main, then, scoffing Mary, turning to their spectral leader, she asked, "Did you drink much wine tonight?" The ghostly mistress replied, "I'd have drunk more if I were heading home to Johnny, but I stopped here first." Since Johnny likely referred to the spectral leader's husband, the line implies she was prioritizing tormenting Mary over returning to her domestic duties. The dialogue was weaponizing mundane details, like drinking and returning home to destabilize Mary. By framing their supernatural attacks as trivial pranks, the tormentors amplified her helplessness. The entire episode seemed to be designed to highlight the coven-like behavior of the witches that blended mundanity with malice, to make them both terrifying and yet believable to their contemporaries. The coven leader's casual tone trivializing Mary's agony underscored the witch's inhumanity in the eyes of those present. Then the phantoms made a frightening prediction. "We'll never leave this house while anyone remains. We'll force everyone to abandon it." This is the end of part 2 of our 4-part series on the Islandmagee Witch Trials of 1711, in which we visited the ghostly hauntings that plagued No Head House and left the family grieving and their young visitor terrified. If you're descended from anyone connected to these events, it would be lovely to hear your family's story in the comments. Share your oral traditions of how these trials shaped your ancestors' lives and their legacy they left for your family. Your voice will help preserve these hidden histories. In part 3, coming soon, we will continue to witness the supernatural events as they occur and follow how, through stringent detective work, the witches were identified one by one, charged and found guilty of their heinous crimes. I will leave a link to part 3 in the description once it is out. Please take time to like this video and, most importantly, subscribe to our channel to encourage us to make more. Since YouTube promotes videos based on the numbers of their subscribers, we need your help to get our videos out there. Thank you.